The clown pulled out a gun
and shot her twice in the face.
Some very excited young people came running out saying something on the order of, "They've shot Joey's mother."
It was one of the worst days of my life.
Could you tell by their gait or by their mannerisms whether the person was a man or a woman?
How often do you hear of a mom being shot at point-blank range by a killer dressed as a clown?
A clown with balloons and flowers and a gun?
cold cases, we have a big puzzle, and some of the pieces are already filled in.
One little bizarre incident and story after another, and they all just connected.
Marlene was outstanding. Do anything for anybody.
Miss Sheila Warren has been indicted for first-degree murder with a firearm.
I do know enough about this case that she's innocent.
On the morning of May 26, 1990, a person dressed as a clown came to the door of Marlene Warren's home in Wellington, Florida. The clown handed her carnations and balloons and then shot and killed her. The murder would send investigators on a decades-long search for the person responsible, unraveling a thread of deceit, theft, and an affair that would ultimately lead to an arrest. This is Victim to Verdict, a clown at the door. Wellington, Florida is an equestrian village.
It was a place where people from Miami, Fort Lauderdale, and West Palm Beach moved in the 80s to get away from some of the crime stemming from the crack cocaine epidemic on the coast.
Drew in a lot of celebrities. It's very close to Mar-a-Lago with folks like Bruce Springsteen. Even Madonna was known to frequent the scene there as well. So it was a place where people wanted to be.
This is upscale. You're talking about some of the best schools in the state, people moving to this area because of what it is. It's like a bubble.
People actually talked about the Wellington bubble and how much they loved it and how safe and secure they felt. And that was until May of 1990.
Saturday, May 26, 1990 is Memorial Day weekend, and in Wellington, that means Memorial Day parades, barbecues, and picnics. For the Warren family, it meant a little bit something different.
So the Warren family is actually made up of husband Michael, his wife Marlene Warren, and their son Joey.
Michael Warren, Marlene Warren's husband, was headed to the racetracks. So Marlene is home, she's comfortable, she's in her gown, she's cooking breakfast for his son.
That morning, I do remember we were eating breakfast. Nice, calm Saturday, I believe it was. It was one of the worst days of my life.
There's a knock at the door. Marlene goes to the door. There is a clown holding flowers and balloons, and she thinks it's some sort of gift.
Well, when she opened the door, I remember, oh, how pretty. You know, flowers and balloons. And then I heard a bang, you know, and my whole world changed.
The clown drops the flowers and the balloons and pulls out a gun and shoots Marlene in the face.
Joey hears the gunshot. He runs to the door, and he sees a clown running away, getting into a Chrysler LeBaron. Meanwhile, his mom on the ground, dying.
I heard what sounded to me like a nail gun, a gun used in construction to drive nails into hard surfaces.
There was a neighbor, Bill Kramer. He was walking his dog, and he heard a gunshot.
Some very excited young people came running out saying something on the order of, "They've shot Joey's mother." My wife said, "Stay there, I'll call 911.
Marlene is transported immediately to a hospital after 911 is called, but she ended up dying 2 days later.
Marlene was outstanding. Friendly, loving, kindness, do anything for anybody.
Always courteous, always respectful.
Where Marlene, she wasn't from Florida, she was from Michigan. And according to her parents, she was actually a kind kid who really loved spending time with her sisters on her grandfather's farm just outside of Detroit. She loved to bake, make art, and paint. And ironically, one of the things she loved to paint was clowns.
This picture here is a painting of a clown. Marlene painted it when she was a teenager, and I think it's quite a coincidence.
And really, it was the whole family who loved clowns.
Yeah, I kind of look at this one right here and say, hey, things will turn out all right. I feel he's sad because Marlene was killed.
Did you buy these after Marlene was killed?
I had him even before.
Marlene became a mother at a very early age. By the time she was 15, she had her first child, who was named John Jr., named after Marlene's husband, John Aarons. She would then have another child by the name of Joey.
Then, tragedy would strike Marlene Warren's life for the first time. Her husband would be killed in an auto accident, leaving her a single mother of 2 children, really before the time she even entered adulthood herself.
Shortly after this incredible tragedy in her life, she meets Michael Warren.
She marries Michael when she's 22, and I think he's 19 actually. He's a bit younger. So marries her, she's got the 2 little kids. They moved to South Florida because Mike had family there. And then they started their life and their businesses, and things seemed to be going well.
Mike and Marlene decide they're gonna start a new life. They move from Michigan down to Florida. Mike gets a job as a meat inspector, but the couple also starts to invest in rental properties. And one by one, they start accumulating these rental properties until finally, they're starting to pull in some real money.
Marlene is running the rental property business day to day and virtually all by herself. They're doing so well at this point, Michael is able to quit his job as a meat inspector and open a used car lot called Bargain Motors.
He had a rental car rent-a-wreck business where he sold to people who didn't have credit and couldn't buy anywhere else. And he also rented old cars.
Change was about to come not only to Mike and Marlene's relationship, but for Marlene Warren, who had already lost a husband, she was about to lose another person that she loved very much.
It's the late 1980s in South Florida, and Michael and Marlene Warren are raising 2 children together. They own more than 20 rental properties and a used car lot. To the outside world, they seem to be living the perfect life.
Mike and Marlene decide to buy their dream home, and they purchase an acre of land in a new subdivision in Wellington, Florida. The subdivision is called the Aero Club.
Michael and Marlene are 2 different people. I mean, Marlene was very capable of fitting in this upscale Wellington community in the country clubs and the cocktail parties. Michael, much more of a loner.
If anything, what gave you the sense that there was a family unit is that Marlene would always almost frame a picture and step in front of him so it would look like a family that was happy.
In the Wellington area, you knew almost everybody, and you would go to the country club or to the grocery store. Michael wasn't part of that. You never ran into him anywheres.
Mike and Marlene had such separate lives that they really didn't spend much time together at all. She and Joey were dealing with all the rental properties and upkeep and collecting rents and so forth. And Michael's life was all about Bargain Motors, going out, having a good time, partying.
Michael loved a few things. He liked cars, he loved horse racing, and he also liked flying. In fact, he became a pilot and would end up owning his own airplane.
He had a plane, and it was stolen, and then it turns up with its engine broken. He had gotten into thoroughbred racing a few years before, and he owned a horse. The horse was somehow kidnapped and found dead. So neighbors were a little suspicious. Like, so many things seemed to happen to this one guy. And he was quite rough around the edges compared to the posh neighbors that he lived among.
Around this time in the spring of 1983, that's when Michael is arrested for odometer tampering at his used car lot.
Well, Mike is actually going in and tampering with the odometers by setting the amount of mileage on the car back. And what that does is he's able to sell the car for more money because it looks like it has less mileage on the car. It really highlights the dark and seedy side of Michael Warren.
Michael ended up pleading guilty. He served 18 months probation, but he was able to avoid prison and keep his business.
For several years, Mike and Marlene are leading together yet separate lives. He's concentrating on the business and spending a lot of time at the racetrack or at his business, while Marlene is dealing with the rental properties, but they're together. Then in 1988, tragedy would strike for the second time.
Her oldest son, John Aarons Jr., dies in the same way that his father died, in a car accident, and he's just 22 years old.
He was driving in Florida, and according to the police reports, he was hit from the back in a collision, and it ended up taking his life.
John Jr.'s death probably just caused a lot of tension, period, and then it kind of manifested in troubles in Michael and Marlene's relationship, it seemed.
The death of Marlene's son, as it does in many marriages, causes some problems, and things aren't great between Marlene and Michael. And this is the time when Sheila starts to enter the picture.
Sheila King was the wife of one of Michael Warren's employees, a tow truck driver named Richard Spud King. People say that when Michael and Sheila King first met, there was an instant connection.
Eventually, Sheila ends up divorcing her husband and connecting and building that relationship with Michael. But the two of them don't come public. They keep it under wraps as best they can, although for those around them, it's obvious.
At the time of the crime, it was alleged that the two of them were having an affair. Michael denied it wholeheartedly the entire time.
That relationship between Michael and Sheila was under the microscope with investigators because they were trying to figure out who had the motive and the opportunity to kill Marlene.
That morning, I do remember we were eating breakfast. Nice, calm Saturday, I believe it was.
It was slightly rainy because it's the beginning of the rainy season. It was in the morning, about 10:45. Marlene and her son and some of her son's friends were at home. There was a knock on the door. Marlene opened it, and she saw a clown standing there.
So Marlene thinks that someone is delivering balloons and flowers to her. Think about what's going through her mind when all that changes and she realizes this clown has a gun.
They hear a shot, or maybe popping balloons. But right before that, they hear Marlene react and say, "Oh, how nice." There's a basket of flowers and 2 balloons, one with Snow White on it. Joey looks and sees somebody dressed like a clown walking away.
He was distraught over the fact that all he could identify was that the clown had brown eyes because the entire identity was covered up head to toe.
My whole world changed. That was the worst day of my life.
The description that Joey gave police was a bit of a problem. Now, while he would later tell them that he thought the clown was someone with a slight build, initially, he told police that it was someone with broad shoulders and big hands. Now, this, of course, threw the investigation off a little bit because police were looking for someone that fit the description of a man.
A woman is literally cooking breakfast for her kids, opens the front door, and is shot to death by a clown. People wanted answers, and people started locking their doors.
Joey's the only eyewitness, but he does see the clown get into the getaway car. It's a white Chrysler LeBaron, and that description, extremely important.
The day before Marlene Warren's funeral, a white Chrysler LeBaron is found in the parking lot of a Winn-Dixie. And inside that LeBaron, they found orange curly fibers and long brown hair.
Michael Warren, of course, is an initial suspect. He's not there. He's at the racetrack when the murder took place. So they started to focus on his girlfriend, Sheila King. And the more they look, the more evidence starts to stack up against her.
The woman we know as Sheila King is also known as Sheila Sheltra. That's her maiden name. And she has a bit of a criminal history dating back to growing up in Central Florida.
Sheila grew up in some of the agricultural communities in Central Florida. These are not your stereotypical South Florida beach towns. These are cattle towns, sugarcane towns. And she grew up headstrong, some say wild, very attractive. They described her long hair as a Crystal Gale type. So she liked boys liked her.
Sheila had an arrest record from when she was pretty young. There was a shoplifting charge, and then a few years later, a theft charge.
You can see from the mug shot, it didn't seem to bother Sheila that she had been busted by police. So you think about what's going through her head. Why are you smiling in this mug shot?
According to people that knew her, Sheila Keene was, at a very early age, associating herself with some bad people and specifically some older men.
Sheila was barely out of high school when she met and started dating Richard Keene, a guy who was 20 years older than her. His nickname was Spud. He was a former Ku Klux Klan member, and he had served time for running marijuana. And she moved to Georgia to be close to where he was in prison for a number of years until he got out.
After Sheila's husband gets out of prison in Georgia, they decide to come back to Florida, and that would be when Sheila Keene met Michael Warren.
Now, Michael, Richard, and Sheila are starting to spend a lot of time together. All three are ex-felons, and they're starting to get into some sketchy activity.
There just seemed to be numerous kind of sketchy ties to Bargain Motors. Sheila was convinced to dress up as a prostitute and meet somebody who had bought a car in a motel, and while she was in there, Richard and Michael, I think they were armed, and they repossessed the car, and then somebody spotted her in the motel room holding the guy at gunpoint, and then they picked her up and they took off.
Eventually, the three become two as Michael and Sheila start to get closer and closer.
So Sheila got an apartment at Pine Ridge, and the folks there assumed that she was married, but not to Richard, to Michael, because of how much time he was spending there. But at that time, Michael was still married to Marlene.
He wasn't coming home, so that said it all.
Neighbors there said he came and went so frequently they thought he was her husband, and they just became more and more enmeshed.
Apparently, co-workers of Michael and Sheila's told investigators at the time of the murder that they thought Sheila and Mike were having an affair. They went for long lunches, they were very affectionate around each other, so there seemed to be a lot of evidence that they were having an affair.
Police records quoted Michael's mother recalling an incident where she went along on one of these racetrack outings. She'd been picking up on the energy between Michael and Sheila. Mom actually said to Sheila, asked her, are you in love with him? Do you love him? And she said she did. And then Mom turned to Michael and was like, are you in love too? And he claimed that he loved himself.
One of Michael's employees at the car dealership told investigators that when Michael and Marlene would have a fight, he would come in raging and offer to pay somebody $10,000 if they would kill his wife. Others remarked that he once said, "I'll make somebody a rich man who'll never have to work again if he gets rid of that woman."
So it wasn't a surprise after Marlene's murder that Michael, her husband, was a prime suspect. But they were also looking at Sheila.
There was speculation that it might not have been Mike. And the reason why is motivation. Most guys, if they would shoot you in the heart. And this lady got shot in the face. So they were starting to wonder whether or not Mike had a girlfriend who did it.
The more that investigators started to look at the couple, at Michael and Sheila, the more the evidence started to pile up, not against the husband, Michael, but against Sheila, the girlfriend.
When Marlene Warren was murdered at her front door by a person dressed as a clown in 1990, the shooter left in a white Chrysler LeBaron. For investigators, finding that car was priority number one.
Just before the murders, there's a couple that rents a car from Payless Rent-A-Car, and they're trying to return the vehicle, and they get confused.
Couple had rented a white Chrysler LeBaron from Payless Cars, another lot nearby, and when it was time to return it, they were looking up the number, I guess, in the phone book, and they got confused between ads and saw Michael's Bargain Motors ad that may have been a bit deceiving.
The ad that Michael Warren took out was absolutely deceiving. If you look at the ad, it looks like an ad for Payless, and the number there is Michael Warren's number.
And they called that number to figure out how to go about dropping off their rental car.
Somebody at Michael's car lot said, "Oh, just leave it outside the gate, put the keys in the windshield wipers, and it'll be fine." Well, the car was subsequently stolen.
So the couple does that, and that car turns out to be the Chrysler LeBaron.
Investigators found the Chrysler LeBaron in a Winn-Dixie parking lot about 5 miles away from where the murder occurred. And inside, they found a number of hairs. Some of them looked to be orange-yellow, like they would have come from an acrylic wig. Apparently, the DNA process at the time wasn't up to the task of identifying exactly what was in those fibers, and hair samples, too.
Besides the car, investigators believe they also found where the suspect purchased the clown costume and those flowers and balloons.
I said, could I ask, please, what this is in reference to? And he said, well, you're probably going to read about it all over the papers tomorrow morning, but a woman was shot at her front door. By a person dressed in a clown costume wearing flowers and balloons, and he shot her in the face. And my heart dropped.
A couple of days before the murder, two women who work at Spotlight Capizio Costume Shop say someone came in to purchase a clown costume.
She said, I need to buy a costume, and I said, can you come back tomorrow? We're closed. And now I really need to get a costume tonight.
A Ruby's clown costume, an afro clown wig, Bob Kelly clown makeup, and a sponge nose.
I'd say probably around 5'8", brown eyes, long chocolate hair, and jeans, and a men's work shirt.
Police found a costume shop in West Palm Beach, and the women that ran it picked Sheila out of a photo lineup, saying that she had been the woman that came a few days before the murder at closing time, desperate to get in and pick out a costume.
I remember some of their description of the customer. It was a woman with a long, dark ponytail, yet there was sort of a male energy, they weren't sure. There was something maybe masculine or tough about her.
She just asked for the clown costume, the wig, and then extra white face paint so she couldn't be identified.
So the connections get crazier and crazier.
There's a public supermarket near where Sheila was living. It was the only place in Palm Beach County that had these particular kinds of Mylar balloons. And the workers at Publix identified a woman with long brown hair who possibly could have been Sheila, who bought those balloons about an hour and a half before the murder.
That employee also able to identify Sheila. Plus, Sheila had actually dressed up like a clown before. There's photographic evidence of Sheila in a clown costume.
When Sheila was married to Richard Keene, they lived in an apartment in a trailer park in Pahokee on the edge of Lake Okeechobee. And she was friendly with people around town, including some folks at the auto parts store. And one day she came in dressed as a clown to entertain the people that worked at the auto parts store. After the murder, people remembered that.
From an outsider's perspective, it may seem like there was enough there to make an arrest, but prosecutors who were combing over the evidence didn't think they had enough to make that arrest.
So about a year later, things take an interesting turn. As the heat is on in this investigation, they're looking at Michael, they're looking at Sheila. Michael and Joey decide to go on a radio show to clear Michael's name. And at this point, Joey is still standing by and believes Michael and Sheila have nothing to do with his mother's murder.
Michael, were you under the impression that you were a suspect from the very beginning?
Most definitely. He never.
Spouse?
Matter of fact, I like to go into detail about that.
In that radio interview, Michael denies any involvement. And as for Sheila, Joey says he's surprised she's even a suspect.
You've either heard about this or been told this, or it's been asked of you that the police were suspicious, and she is even mentioned as a prime suspect in all of this. Would that shock you that she would be a prime suspect?
Yes, it was.
At this point, Joey is still convinced that the clown is a man, despite the fact that investigators are focusing in on Michael and Sheila.
Could you tell by their gait or by their mannerisms whether the person was a man or a woman?
Well, to me, it seemed like a man.
Why?
Because of the big hands and the size of the person.
Joey's description was of a man, and now all of the other evidence that is starting to come in points directly at a woman.
And remember, Michael had an alibi for the time of the murder. So while the evidence seemed to be pointing to both Michael and Sheila, Sheila was really the only potential suspect.
There's another really great little twist in this story. There was an attorney, local attorney, who represented Joey Aarons.
Her youngest son got into some trouble, ended up being charged with a crime, and they went to court. They hired an attorney, the family did, a guy by the name of Christopher DeSantos.
Joey was a young man, probably about 18 at the time, who was referred to me by an office mate I shared office space with, and he was charged with attempted murder, as I recall. He was basically hanging around with a gang of kids, and one of them ended up doing something unexpected, and he was there, so he got charged with it.
There's an interaction that takes place after a hearing at the courthouse between DeSantos, the lawyer, and Michael Warren, which is unbelievable.
They were walking out of the courtroom celebrating, and Mike Warren just casually asked if a man is going to hire someone to kill their wife, would that mean they not get any of the estate?
And he blurted out asking me if a man could inherit if he murdered his wife. And my first emotional reaction was I was a little bit stunned. I kind of handled it as though it were a cocktail party question. If you murdered your wife, the law said you couldn't inherit. But for example, if it were manslaughter that you could inherit, or if somebody else had murdered your wife, you could inherit.
Then Attorney DeSantos would say something he would later regret.
For example, if you wore a clown suit, it wasn't intended to advise them to wear a clown suit or anything like that, but the point was that if you can't prove identity, the perpetrator, you can't get a conviction. Right after I said it, oh God, I'm sorry I made that statement. And based on what I had found out later on about him, I certainly wouldn't have made the statement.
That is unreal. It seems, and this is what I would argue, this lawyer gave him a recipe for murder.
As all of this is coming out, it would also come to light that Marlene was telling people she was scared of her husband right before her murder.
And Marlene's parents say, months, weeks, days before she was killed, she was saying how she wanted to divorce Mike Warren, but she was afraid that he was going to kill her.
As weeks turned into months after Marlene Warren was murdered at her front door by a person dressed as a clown, investigators were dialed into her husband and his girlfriends as suspects, but there was no arrest. They needed more evidence.
So Michael and Sheila do not acknowledge any sort of romantic relationship, but the people that they work with are a little suspicious. Then, a year after Marlene dies, they kind of let their guard down a little bit and took a vacation together in the Bahamas.
Michael and Sheila are spotted at a fancy hotel resort casino in the Bahamas. And some couple there tunes into them and notices when they come in, Sheila seems uneasy, but then Michael is his usual loud, braggart self, and just being a big, loud guy, and people took notice, and that ended up being another tip that went to police.
A year has gone by now and there are no arrests, but there's so much speculation that Mike and Sheila had something to do with Marlene's murder. So Mike goes on a radio show.
Have you severed all your business ties with Sheila Keene? Is she any longer involved in any of your business?
No.
Are you still using the Keene Company?
I use different repossession companies.
All right, but is Keene one of those that you still use?
Yes.
So you still do have at least some relationship, business relationship with the Keene repo business?
With Mr. Keene, yeah.
With Mr. Keene. Have you spoken to Sheila?
I've spoken to both of them in the past, yes.
When was the last time you spoke to Sheila?
Probably about a month ago.
Investigators decided to look at Michael's business, Bargain Motors.
This seems to be a classic example of investigators turning up the heat on Michael Warren. They think he has something to do with his wife's murder, so what do? They investigate his business, get a search warrant. Next thing you know, he is under arrest.
Initially, the investigators were focused on Michael and Sheila, but they had no evidence. So they started surveilling his place of business, his rental car company and car lot. And eventually they got subpoenas and they went through all his records. Now, Michael had been arrested for odometer tampering years before. And lo and behold, they found he'd been doing the same thing at this car lot.
They go in with a search warrant and raid the place and take away tons of boxes of paperwork, eventually charge Michael with odometer tampering, like 20 racketeering charges, and a laundry list.
The problem was that while investigators were able to put Michael away for a little while, there was nothing of significant value to connect him or Sheila to the murder.
Michael Warren is found guilty on a number of charges: racketeering, odometer fraud, theft. Bottom line is, he ends up getting sentenced to 9 years in prison.
For a few years, the investigation really seems to be going cold. But then, there's a potential break in the case. A son of an employee at Bargain Motors contacts police saying he has information linking Michael Warren to his wife's murder.
Have you ever heard of a deathbed confession? My father told me everything that happened before he died.
This individual's son came forward and said that my father told me that you'll find all of the answers if you pull up a vehicle that is in the water, and he showed him exactly where to look.
I knew where the car was, I knew who planned it, I knew where the gun was at. He told me that car would get me anything I ever wanted from Mike Warren.
So this is big. Investigators believe that inside the vehicle underwater is the murder weapon and the clown costume used in Marlene's murder.
So the police sent divers down and they looked and looked and looked.
And sure enough, they found the vehicle. The problem is they didn't find anything of value inside the vehicle.
At some point, detectives dove and found a car. According to the photographic evidence that was made available to the public, it doesn't appear that they found a clown costume or a gun.
So now it's back to square one. The case is cold.
In 2002, Michael Warren and Sheila Keene head to Las Vegas to get married. And at this point, the investigation into Marlene Warren's death has really come to a halt.
Sheila Keene Warren and Michael Warren were married after his prison stint.
When Marlene's parents find out that Michael, Marlene's husband, marries Sheila, they are livid because they are convinced that Sheila is the killer clown.
I turned angry when I heard Mike had married Sheila, remembering that she killed my daughter and he marries her. You know there's got to be something there.
Then in 2013, the case is reopened. But the fact that Michael and Sheila are now married puts Sheila back as a prime suspect.
As far as the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office has disclosed, they got a grant to look at some cold cases, and one of them was the Wellington clown murder, and were able to take the evidence that they still had from almost 30 years previously, and then the fact that they discovered that she and Michael were married.
It was rumored that Sheila Keene and Michael Warren were having an affair. We now have learned since then that they have married, and they are currently married. We kind of formed a little task force with members of the State Attorney's Office and the FBI, and we went back and interviewed numerous witnesses, reviewed the evidence, were able to submit new evidence for DNA analysis, and in doing so, we were able to get the indictment.
By this point, Mike and Sheila have reinvented themselves. They've moved to a small town in the Blue Ridge Mountains in Virginia by the name of Abington.
Sheila has even changed her name to Debbie, and none of the folks in that new town know about their past.
More than 20 years after Marlene Warren was murdered in Wellington, Florida, investigators reopened the case. The prime suspect, Sheila Keene, was now married to Michael Warren, the victim's husband.
Mike and Sheila have now moved to a town called Abington, Virginia, and this is where their new life is started.
They're living, according to neighbors, a great life. People say they get along with everyone. Neighbors even talk about how much they seem to be in love, and people look at them and think, oh, what a great couple.
They're very friendly, outgoing, nice. He was a happy, affectionate type person. They would hug you when you'd go see him.
If you needed something, you call them and they'd be there.
They were very close, and there was a connection of their smile at each other, the twinkle of their eye. They were very much in love, very close.
They've opened up a fast food restaurant across the border in the state of Tennessee.
So when the cold case reopens, they track Michael and his bride, Sheila Keene, to a restaurant in Tennessee, the Purple Cow.
The Purple Cow was across the line in Kingsport, and they ran this drive-through restaurant that seemed to be very popular, and they seemed to be doing very well because they had lots of toys. They had a boat at their house on a lake, and they entertained frequently. They were not hiding, and they didn't seem to be accused felons on the run.
They finally started living their life instead of working.
They seemed very open. He seemed to be a happy, laid-back kind of guy.
But not everyone who came across Mike and Debbie, especially Mike, had good things to say about him. There was one neighbor that had an encounter with Mike that seemed to show another side.
I told him to put down the rocks and get off our property.
So apparently Michael Warren decided to take some rocks from his neighbor's property, but it didn't go so well.
And it said, can't we be neighborly about this? And I told him, I said, the neighborly thing would be to call over and ask if you could come over here and do that. He said, you. And he's like, what are you going to do, you scrawny? I said, I'll tell you what I'm going to do, you fat ass. But he wouldn't get off the tractor, and so he unloaded the rock.
He was the bully.
Somebody thinks he's going to get what he wants.
Yes, exactly.
Michael and Sheila pretty much keep their past lives to themselves, but it did come up at least once when Sheila was drinking.
They found an employee who said that one night during a company party, Sheila, who they knew as Debbie, was drinking, and she told them basically this story of how she had gotten away with murder in Florida. The details of that conversation aren't included in depth in the police report, but it does appear that, at least according to this one employee, it came back up while they were, living their new life.
Meanwhile, back in Florida, detectives, with the help of DNA technology, would get a break in the case that would help lead to an arrest.
September 26th, 2017. Mike and Sheila are driving in their Cadillac SUV, coming back from Vermont, coming home to Abington, when they get pulled over by police.
On the way to jail, she doesn't ask why she's being arrested, but her one question to the arresting officer was, is my husband being arrested too?
The defendant in this case, Miss Sheila Keene Warren, has been indicted for first-degree murder with a firearm. The potential penalty in this case is life in prison.
We don't know if there'll be anybody else charged in this. That remains to be seen. But we want to make sure that we do everything that we possibly can to make sure that the prosecution is successful.
After 27 years, Sheila Keene Warren under arrest, despite the fact that she was the focus of the investigation all along.
As she's walking in, there's video of her being brought into the police station and then a mugshot. You look at the mugshot after she's taken into custody, she's smiling in the mugshot, just like she was smiling in the mugshot when she was arrested as a teenager.
I do know enough about this case, not from the discovery process, but from my knowledge of the case, that she's innocent. My client will plead not guilty. She vehemently denies her guilt.
We got a glimpse into the evidence against Sheila Keene Warren at a bond hearing where the lead investigator of the reopened investigation took the stand.
The wig comparisons, he reported multiple monocrylic yellow-orange wig fibers compared to the wig purchased at the Spotlight, and that they had same microscopic characteristics and optical properties. Multiple maroon fibers from Sheila Keene's shoes, the same microscopic characteristics and optical properties of fibers from the carpet samples from the parent.
While she's been incarcerated, Sheila Keene Warren has been writing a lot of letters. We've taken a look at them, and when you read the words that she has written, it is clear that she believes she is innocent and that she will be found not guilty and will have a life and be happily ever after married to Michael.
Despite maintaining her innocence, on April 25th, 2023, Sheila Keene Warren appeared in court to accept a plea deal.
Do you still wish to plead guilty and have me impose the sentence as outlined in the plea agreement?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Rosenfeld, do you want to change your plea, please?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, Ms. Keene Warren withdraws her previously entered plea and her plea of guilty as outlined in the plea agreement.
Ms. Keene Warren, I find that you have made a knowingly voluntary, intelligent waiver of your rights. You know the charges against you and appreciate the consequences of the plea. And by the way, I didn't ask you this. Do you agree with the amount of credit that was mentioned earlier, and it's also signed off on the sheet, which is 2,039 days credit?
Yes.
And you realize by agreeing to the number 2039, you're waiving any affirmative right to appeal the number 2039 as far as your credit is concerned. Understand that?
Yes.
Mr. Ahrens, do you wish to make any type of statement?
The only thing I want to say is, all through this trial, I didn't see any remorse. God be with her.
In the end, we thought this settlement was best for the interest of justice. And one thing for sure, after years of protesting her innocence, Sheila Keene Warren is now a convicted felon. She was forced to admit that she was the murderer. She was the one who murdered Marlene Warren, and she'll be a murderer for the rest of her days.
I feel a lot better. I feel relieved, 1,000 pounds light. You know, I've got this energy now that I should have had a long time ago. Me and the state said, yeah, we'll take a plea, but we wanted more time, but that didn't happen. When she starts to live her life again, it's not gonna be what she thinks. She's got a lot of stuff to go through. She's gonna have a lot of stuff. I just saw no remorse, and that tells me that she's gonna live in hell.
Sheila Keene Warren pled guilty to second-degree murder. Marlene's husband, Michael, was never charged in relation to her death. Sheila was sentenced to 12 years. With time served, Sheila and Michael will be reunited when she's released sometime in the year 2025.